All right, time for Module 4. This one is probably going to be a lot shorter than the others, but we'll see. Module 4 is all about the behaviorist invasion, quote unquote. It was kind of an invasion in the US mostly, not so much in Europe. But we're going to talk about the major behaviorist figures Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner. And we're going to talk about what behaviorism is philosophically and methodologically, and how it affected psychology moving forward. And we're also going to talk a little bit towards the end about, I call them hippies here. They are kind of hippies. We're going to talk a little bit about the humanistic movement at the end of this chapter. Um, they don't really, it's kind of hard to fit them into their own module because they overlap so much with all kinds of different time periods, and the behaviorist time period is more of its own time period and kind of deserves its own module slash week, so they're kind of shoehorned in at the end. Anyway, behaviorism as a school of thought basically says, look, if you're going to be a real science, you cannot talk about things that are not directly, objectively measurable, quantifiable, observable. So these abstract things like thoughts and beliefs, when you try and explain why people do the things they do or why people engage in certain behaviors, you can talk about the stimuli they've experienced and the behavior that they subsequently engage in, but nothing that happens in between. The brain and the mind have no place in behavioristic psychology if you're a hardcore behaviorist. The brain and the mind are a black box. You don't talk about what's going on inside the box, you talk about what's going on outside the box. Because outside the box is where objective, observable, measurable, quantifiable stuff, concrete stuff, can be measured. Another tenet of behaviorism is that basically all of our behaviors are driven by our experiences. Our experiences are linked together. We form associations. That's where all of our, I don't, a behaviorist wouldn't use the word concept. They'd maybe use a word like stimulus discrimination or stimulus generalization, because those are behaviors, and you can measure the degree to which an organism is showing an ability to discriminate between two different types of stimuli or to generalize from one stimulus to another stimulus. But in general, if they were to use the word concepts, they'd say that our concepts are formed from associating stimuli together in the environment. The behaviorists were oftentimes materialists. Most scientists are at least methodological materialists. Materialism is the view that the only things that exist are things that are made of physical matter. And I'd say, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I'd say most scientists, it's understandable that they would be a materialist, because if you're studying the physical sciences like chemistry and astronomy and whatnot, you're studying literal physical things. So it's understandable that some psychologists who want to pursue an objective science, something that's akin to the physical sciences, would say, well, we're not going to talk about things like souls and beliefs and free will and goals in life and stuff. We're going to talk about nerve impulses, reflexes, behavior, stimuli. They were very exclusive about what could be talked about and what could not be talked about. What are legitimate things to theorize about? What are illegitimate things to theorize about? And this was a big departure from uh, the way psychology was being practiced at the time, because at the time, William James was an introspectionist. He was analyzing his own thoughts. Wundt over in Europe was studying, well, he thought he was studying the science of consciousness, but consciousness, as in conscious experiences, or our experience of the world, the sort of qualitative nature of our experiences, what it's like to be us, those sorts of things have no place in behaviorism. And we talked a bit about positivism in one of the previous lectures. Positivism is just an attempt to get rid of any kind of metaphysics from your thought system. Metaphysics have to do with what exists and what doesn't exist. Does free will exist? Is there a God? These are the sorts of questions a positivist would say, no, no, no. These aren't empirical questions. The only valid questions are empirical questions because we have a method for adjudicating who's right in a dispute over empirical fact. These other things, there's no way of telling who's right and who's wrong. And many people who are sympathetic to positivism also just don't believe in things like free will and God and the soul and things like that. They're all into physical, observable stuff. So let's talk about the first major behaviorist figure. It was the Russian physiologist Pavlov. Hopefully that name rings a bell. Pavlov is talked about a lot in Introduction to Psychology. He famously did these studies with dogs. He would have these dogs rigged up to systems that would measure how much they're salivating. And, Pavlov's lab assistants would come in with food. The dogs would get excited and start salivating a lot. It just so happened that there was this tone or bell that would ring whenever the lab assistants would come in. Mostly it was to come bring the dogs food, but sometimes they were coming in for other reasons, and they noticed the dogs would start salivating even if they weren't bringing in food. So it wasn't a physiological response to the smell of the food or the sight of the food, it was a physiological response to the expectation of food. So Pavlov developed this theoretical framework for how to study the way in which organisms associate certain stimuli with other stimuli. This tone or bell causes me or my system, my physical system, to expect that there's going to be food. Food is like reflexively causes me to salivate and start emitting hunger-like behaviors. I start pursuing food and getting excited and whatnot. And Pavlov said you can generalize this to all behavior eventually. He didn't have a very high opinion of psychology as a science. At the time, there was a perception that psychology was really little more than a branch of philosophy. It was a bunch of people sitting in their armchairs speculating about how the mind works and about consciousness. Earlier, when I was talking about the qualitative nature of your experiences or something like that, you probably picked up on the fact that even I have trouble really explaining what it is a lot of introspective psychologists were primarily talking about. Naturally, people who are in the physical sciences, a physiologist like Pavlov, is not going to see that as being very objective. And he would coach his students. When his students would try to describe the behaviors of their dogs or their other animal research subjects, Pavlov was really starting, after he made this realization, he started working on this framework of the conditioned and the unconditioned reflexes and stimulus and all that. He got really serious about pushing this theoretical agenda of, hey, we can describe all of behavior by stimuli, reflexes, and conditioning. Conditioning is where you just develop an association or an expectation from one stimulus being associated with another stimulus. And this goes back to Aristotle and the empiricists, Locke, Hume, all that. It's basically those philosophers' ideas being brought into the lab. It's just the idea that we develop our expectations and our concepts and our memories by associating certain experiences with certain other experiences. Here, though, Pavlov is saying, well, we can get rid of these ideas of memory and expectations. We can just study the behavior. Okay, Pavlov's a physiologist. He has no time for this mushy philosophy stuff, talking about the mind, experience, expectations. Over in America, we had John Watson. Supposedly, Watson came up with the basic idea of behaviorism largely independent of Pavlov. I find that hard to believe, but Pavlov came up with the behaviorist ideas that I just described well before Watson, and Watson's ideas are very similar, so it's kind of hard to give Watson credit for coming up with all this on his own, even if he tries to claim that credit. Um, but anyway, when Watson originally started studying psychology, I don't know if he actually majored in psychology. He was more of a animal behavior guy, an ethologist, and he early in his career he studied animal behavior. But when he did study psychology, whether it was for a class or for a major, I don't remember. He was taught Titchener's version and James's version of psychology, and this wouldn't have impressed someone like Watson. Watson was someone who was more enamored by the more skeptical, the more physical types of sciences. And supposedly, Watson started developing what he thought were these radical ideas of, hey, let's get rid of all this consciousness and introspection, and let's do more what the animal people do. Let's just study the behaviors and, like, how do they respond to certain stimuli. With animals, we don't speculate too much about their mental life. We just stick to the objective facts. Let's apply that to humans. Let's stop talking about the mental life of humans. Watson claimed not to have a mental life, which is, I again have trouble believing that. But whatever, that's what he said. There's no way to really prove him wrong, I guess. So apparently Watson started having these ideas relatively early in his career, but he was told by the higher ups, the more senior members of the field, that that's not going to work and people aren't going to accept that. So Watson kept these ideas to himself for a while. But eventually, as luck may have it, he became editor of a journal called Psychological Review. It kind of fell into his lap because one of his colleagues who was in charge of Psychological Review was caught in a brothel. Back then, getting a divorce or being caught in a brothel was a certified career-ending offense. Nowadays, it's becoming a career-ending offense. Well, not divorce, but it's just funny how the moral standards and what will automatically get you fired really changed a lot, and in some ways is kind of going back. I don't know. That's a topic for another day. But now that Watson was the editor of this prestigious journal, he was able to be a gatekeeper for who gets published and who doesn't, at least in this one journal. So he started using that platform to promote his ideas about basically using the framework of animal behavior studies, ethology, and whatnot on humans, and this really caught on. He promoted that view. He eventually became the president of the APA, and he was a major figure in psychology. He was kind of the guy for a while. So how radical of a behaviorist was Watson? Well, for one, Watson didn't, like I said, he said that he didn't have a mental life. And he claimed that thinking, quote unquote thinking, was nothing more than the minute movements of the mouth and larynx, because he believed thoughts and speech were pretty much the same thing. Speech is something that can be measured. When does speech begin and end? The physical properties of speech. How loud is it? This is something physical and measurable. And speech is kind of like a thought, conceptually. Well, Watson just went the full hog and said, speech and thought are the same thing. And whenever you're quote unquote thinking, you're really just talking, but you're just not talking uh, loud enough for other people to hear you. I'm going to hold for laughter. If you can't tell, I'm not terribly sympathetic to the behaviorist point of view. He also had this quote, which I think is very revealing. He said, saying is doing, that is, behaving. Speaking overtly or to ourselves, thinking, is just as objective a type of behavior as baseball. So to him, everything has to be a behavior, something you can watch. You can write down statistics. In some ways, he went a little further than Pavlov and the other Russian physiological psychologists or physiologists who were dabbling in psychology over in Russia, because Watson even downplayed the role of instincts in behavior. He was what you'd call a radical environmentalist, and by radical environmentalist, he means that the environment, the stimuli you experience, really shape how you're going to behave. So there's really nothing coming from the organism itself. It's not that he was an environmental terrorist or something like that. He just believed that we're subject to our environment. Here's a good quote that really illustrates how he viewed the world. And if you squint, it almost sounds like a nice way of looking at things. He said, give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own specified world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief, regardless of his talents, pensions, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. So on the one hand, it's kind of a nice idea that it doesn't matter if what your background is. You can always be trained to be the best at something. You can always acquire new skills. People are these works of progress that are continuously developing, continuously being shaped by their environment. But it also, when I say shaped by your environment, it kind of stops sounding so romantic when you say it that way, because I think people like to believe that they have what it takes to create themselves and to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. That sounds nice. But when you say it all depends on your environment, well, that makes it sound like you're not in control of anything. And that's precisely what Watson believed. You're not in control of what you become. Your environment is in control of what you become. Some of you may have heard of the Little Albert study. This was a study in stimulus generalization. So what they did was they had this little baby named Little Albert, and they found that if you terrified the child by making a really loud noise every time you brought out a certain stimulus, in this instance it was a rabbit, the child would learn to become scared and react to the rabbit in more or less the same way it would react to the scary sound. So it developed an association. It was conditioned to be afraid of the rabbit. So far, this isn't terribly surprising. But they found that the child would eventually start reacting to other stimuli that are similar to the rabbit, but not quite the same. So for instance, if it was a white rabbit, it might become terrified if you bring one of those little costume beards, little light beard that a mall Santa might wear. The child will get scared and because it looks a little bit like the rabbit, So the child is showing the child is showing that its conditioned behavior generalizes to stimuli that aren't as physically similar to some degree to the original stimulus it was conditioned to respond that way for. And Watson was excited about these findings and excited about the fact that his explanation was objective. He was looking at stimuli, physical things that you can measure, the time differences between the exposure to one stimulus and different stimulus. These were all objective things. And he contrasted this with what the Freudians were doing. Freudianism or psychoanalysis was still fairly popular at the time. This is around the 1930s in America when the Little Albert study was done. And, of course, to a behaviorist, the Freudians look like they're absolutely like engaging in fantasy, science fiction, and not even very good fantasy. So Watson said the Freudians will probably tease from him. He's talking about little Albert. He'll get him to recite a dream which upon their analysis will show that Albert at 3 years of age attempted to play with the pubic hair of the mother and was scolded violently for it. Albert may be fully convinced that the dream was a true revealer of the factors which brought about the fear. So what he's saying here is, someone gets scared by seeing a rabbit or anything that's vaguely similar to the rabbit. That's because of stimulus generalization. Whereas a Freudian would try and say you had some sort of traumatic experience and that was revealed symbolically in your dreams, and it's symbolism that's driving your response, not stimulus generalization, which is a phenomenon that's steeped more in concrete, observable, experimental results. So Watson's contrasting himself here with something that's not quite connected to empirical data. So Watson was very passionate about applying behaviorism to work on kids. And to be fair to him, this was a cruel study, and I kind of wanted to punch Watson for this because my son is about the age of little Albert, and I would be furious if someone did this study with my son. But to this day, behaviorist or behaviorist-inspired therapies are used, especially for getting rid of phobias, but also for treating people that are on the spectrum. Applied behavior analysis is a very behaviorist or behavior-inspired study. So it's not all bad. So Watson was flying high in the world of psychology. He was one of its biggest stars. And early in his career, he married one of his students, and he started a family with that student. But after his rise to fame, he had an affair with his research assistant. I believe it was the one he was working with in the Little Albert studies. And that was a big no-no at the time, having an affair and getting divorced and all of that. You can't get a divorce in this time period and not be disgraced. So he was forced to resign. And Watson kept writing, not in professional or scientific journals. He started writing more towards a popular audience, and if anything, this made behaviorism more popular. Sometimes it's if you want your science to be widely accepted, sometimes you want to go through the professors and the academics and stuff, but going straight to the incoming students and indoctrinating them on their way into academia, then that's also a good way to go about it. Burn it at both ends. He ended up working in the advertising industry after he kind of landed on his feet and was making a whole lot more money than he probably ever made or ever could have made in academia. So, yeah, he got fired. He still was active in psychology, in the academic side of psychology, but he was kicked out for all of that affair stuff. He ended up being okay financially, and like I said, in some ways, it might have even been good for behaviorism. Maybe not for Watson personally, but it was good for behaviorism as a movement, you could say. Now, I want to stop and reflect on the difference between philosophical or radical behaviorism, which not everyone is these days. I have met some people that are like that, and methodological behaviorism. So, someone who's a philosophical behaviorist or a radical behaviorist is someone who believes all this stuff or something along the lines of all the stuff I've been talking about. There's no free will, you're a product of your environment. Anything that can't be directly observed has no place in science, it's just fantasy. That's different from methodological behaviorism, which is what the vast majority, if not all, psychologists use these days. And methodological behaviorism is basically a methodology where you say, I'm not going to conclude anything from my data that I haven't shown to show up in people's behavior. I control the stimuli going in, and I can observe the behavior that comes out, and I can speculate about what these interactions mean for what's inside the black box. You remember when I said for a behaviorist it's stimuli in, behavior out. Whatever happens in between in the mind or in the brain is off limits. Well, nowadays we're allowed to speculate. We say we're going to speculate about what's in the black box based off of stimuli in and behavior out. But we did take the behaviorists' methodology of, let's be rigorous and let's measure what's going in and measuring what goes out. To an extent, Wundt was already kind of doing this, but in the US, behaviorists were really pushing this. People were picking it up a lot more. And yeah, so like when you experiment, let's say, so I'm going to give you an example of methodological behaviorism. Let's say I want to test two different advertisements. I think there's a control advertisement that's normal, and then there's a special experimental one that's got a little extra element to it that I think is going to result in more people wanting to buy the product. I randomly assign some people to watch the control advertisement, and I randomly assign all the other ones that left over to watch the new experimental one. And when you do that, a behaviorist would only talk about the properties of the advertisements and how it affected the different groups. And you can't really talk about why it worked. To them, the fact that it worked is enough. And you can talk about maybe why did the stimuli drive the behavior. But to someone who's allowed to talk about what's going on in the mind, someone like me, I open up the black box and I speculate about what's in there. I might say, well, look, this new part of the advertisement, we added it because we wanted to make the viewer feel a little insecure about their body. And so the control one didn't do that, but the experimental one did. And let's say the product is some sort of a weight loss thing or some sort of fitness thing. When you make people feel less satisfied with their body with this advertisement, makes them more willing to go and buy the product or the service or whatever. See, that's all cognitive stuff. I'm talking about people's insecurities. I'm talking about people's body satisfaction. That's the kind of thing a behaviorist won't tolerate. You can maybe find a way to talk about something that kind of looks like body satisfaction steeped in behaviorist language. For instance, I talked about concepts earlier. A behaviorist won't talk about concepts, but they will talk about stimulus generalization. Little Albert showed stimulus generalization because he didn't just get scared of rabbits, he would get scared of things that kind of looked like the rabbit. So to a behaviorist, that's how they're going to treat the idea of a concept. It's stimulus generalization. So you can find ways in strict behaviorist, philosophical behaviorism, radical behaviorism, you can find ways to talk about things that are vaguely similar to what's going on inside the mind or the brain, like concepts, and perhaps body satisfaction, but you're kind of transforming the topic to be not about what's going on inside, but what's going on outside. It's not a concept inside the mind; it's a behavior. You're showing that stimuli that are similar enough will elicit behaviors that weren't originally associated with those similar stimuli, but the behaviors will be emitted regardless. So, one of the major figures in psychology at the time was a behaviorist in a sense, but he was kind of a different kind of behaviorist. He wasn't as strict as all the other behaviorists. This was Tolman, and he demonstrated something called latent learning. And what Tolman did in a famous study, this was Tolman and Hanzik, is they put some rats in a maze. This is what a lot of behaviorist studies were, rats in mazes, and working on animals in general. But what they do is they put the rats in the maze, and there would be this certain room at the end of the maze, which they would later start putting food in as a reward for finding that part of the maze. But for the first several trials, they would put the rats in there, and the rats would just kind of explore the maze. No behaviors are being reinforced. There's no reward, no punishment. So, according to a behaviorist, no behaviors should become more likely than any other behaviors. But once they started putting that food in the maze, the rats showed that they could uh, find the food, and then later, if you blocked the specific path they used to get to the food, they would appear to know how to take an alternate route, a detour. So, to a behaviorist, this is kind of hard to explain. If you're someone like Tolman who believes in latent learning and what he called cognitive maps, um, Tolman said, look, there are things going on inside the black box. The rats are learning the layout of the maze. There's information about the maze that's being stored and can be used to get rewards. So I want to talk about that stuff and theorize about that stuff. He called it a cognitive map. So the rat wasn't reinforced to go that specific route to go towards the food, but since it has some internal storage about the layout of the maze, it's able to find an alternate route. No problem for Tolman, who's not a strict radical behaviorist. For the behaviorist, this is kind of hard to explain. See, when the rats were wandering around the maze, no behaviors were being reinforced or punished, so there's no reason why any one route should be more likely to be taken than any other route. And when you block a route, um, why would the rat suddenly go and take the precise route that's the shortest one available? You know, after you block the main one, they take the next best one and go to the food. How do you explain that they took that specific route? They've never been reinforced to do that behavior. To behaviorists, there's no thinking and strategizing and problem solving. There's just you've been reinforced to do certain things before, so you're going to keep doing them. So why did that happen? Well, they have their explanations. To me, they seem kind of like they're bending over backwards, struggling to try and exclude things for just for the sake of excluding them. But Tolman started revealing. I'm gonna show my bias here a little more. Tolman started revealing the chinks in the behaviorist armor. You can't just study behavior and stimuli. You might have to posit some internal representations or some internal knowledge. So during this time, there was a movement in philosophy and really throughout much of academia called logical positivism. This was a big influence on the behaviorist movement. This was over in Europe. So a lot of people say behaviorism was centered more in America, which is true in the sense that the behaviorist school of thought in psychology was mostly an American phenomenon. But as a more philosophical way of looking at the world, it was fairly well represented in Europe as well. So, what the logical positivist said is that, look, there's certain theoretical entities. If you posit their existence, then you can set up experiments that will show that they exist. So, like with Tolman's cognitive maps, you can say, look, if you're just looking at the behavior of, stimulus in, behavior out, then it doesn't make much sense that the rats are doing what they do. And, physicists were having similar problems where if you just go with what can be seen with the existing scientific instruments and with the existing scientific theories, there are certain phenomena that don't fully make sense. So what you do is you posit theoretical entities, like you can't see atoms, you can't see subatomic particles, especially back then, maybe now you can. You can't see these things, you can't observe them. But if you theorize that they exist, then you can set up experiments that kind of use the reasoning. If these things do exist, then you should see these consequences in this experiment. You kind of deduce, if these things exist, you should see this. You set up a situation to test whether that theory is true. So you could have unobservable stuff in this school of thought, but it had to still be very much tied to how you measure it. Some of them would say an atom is just to be defined as the means of measuring that an atom exists. Or, something's temperature, they would even say the idea of temperature is too abstract and you can't, it doesn't really add up when you try to really define something like temperature. So let's just say, no, temperature is the reading of a thermometer. It's what a thermometer says. We're not going to get all philosophical and try and define what temperature is as this abstract thing apart from the means by which we measure it. Ultimately, even if you are allowed to have these theoretical entities, everything has to be broken down into the empirical observations. If there's not some set of empirical observations that would correspond to what you're talking about, then it's nonsense, according to this school of thought. It's no better than gibberish. So you can see why it's a pretty restrictive school of thought. It kind of allows you a little more wiggle room to theorize about some things that aren't directly observable, but they're still very close to the vest. Everything has to be tied closely back to observable stuff. Interestingly enough, these logical positivists, and I'll say many of the behaviorists working today and back in the day, believed in this idea that there's going to be a unified science one day, that, physics is what's at the bottom of everything. Chemistry ultimately boils down to physics. Chemistry is just a more complex version of physics. It's zooming out and looking at different phenomena that ultimately boil down to physical processes. And then in turn, biology is just a matter of chemistry. Everything breaks down to chemistry. Tissues and cells and organs and organ systems and organisms are ultimately just a bunch of chemicals. And then psychology one day will just be boiled down to biology. There's some people today who would have no problem saying that psychology is really just something we have temporarily until biology can kind of take over what the psychologists are doing. And I'd say that aligns pretty well with what behaviorists believed, although it depends on which behaviorist you're talking about, because nowadays there are a lot of behaviorists that are very biologically oriented, but as you saw earlier, Pavlov, he was a physiologist, so of course he was sympathetic to biology, but Watson was not. Watson didn't even want to talk about instincts and stuff like that. So if you didn't think that was all restrictive enough, you also have this guy, B.F. Skinner, and his version of behaviorism went even further than logical positivism. So you remember all that talk of theoretical entities? So you're allowed to posit that maybe certain processes or maybe certain things do exist. We can't directly observe them, but we can observe the consequences of their existence if we set up the right experiment. Well, Skinner went even further than that and said, we're going to be atheoretical. We're not going to posit anything. We're not going to talk about things that we can't directly see. He said, look, our behaviors have consequences. The behaviors operate on the environment, and the environmental response to our behaviors shape our future behaviors. Whenever we emit some behavior, we're either rewarded or punished for it, and that is all you need. That's all the metaphysics you need. We don't need to be talking about cognitive maps or memories or body image. It's all behavior and consequences. So yeah, that's behaviorism in a nutshell. We had just a few major figures: Pavlov, Watson. I talked briefly about Tolman, and I talked briefly about Skinner. There's a lot more I could have said about them, but these are kind of the bare necessities. Moving over to the humanistic psychologists, this school of thought kind of came into its own in the 1960s. This is at a time when you could say, in the US at least, behaviorism and psychoanalysis were the two main schools of thought. And think about it, behaviorism says that we are basically these biological machines that have no free will, that we're a product of our environment, we have no say so in what we end up being. And according to psychoanalysts, we are these sick, twisted perverts beneath the surface. We all pretend like we're good, decent people, or we try to, but deep down we have all these sick urges and jealousy and inferiority complexes. It's really, we all have these really dark stuff beneath the surface that's always trying to manifest it in our behavior. So none of these schools of thoughts really cast humanity in a very positive light. So in comes the humanistic psychologist movement, which again was around the 1960s. The 1960s was also when the hippies started showing up. I don't know if that's a coincidence. I think it's not. A lot of people will just call the humanistic psychologists hippies. But they basically came along and said, hey, we think humans are, special. They're not just animals. They deserve respect, and they have free will. They have higher purpose in life than just being rewarded or punished and then dying at some point. We're not these sick, sadistic perverts with all these sick urges and dark stuff boiling beneath the surface. And I'm going to also get into how they changed the therapeutic setting. See, with behaviorism, you manipulate people into, if there's a certain behavior that you need stopped, then you punish that behavior and you encourage other behaviors that are more desirable. So if you want a child to stop throwing tantrums, you reward them for when they're being good and you punish them for when they throw tantrums. So you're not really reasoning with the child. And as a parent of young children, I do see the logic in that. But it is ultimately kind of a way of coercing people. When you're treating adults, instead of reasoning with them or talking through it with them, you reward certain behaviors and punish others. You're sort of coercing them. In psychoanalysis, you lay people down, you talk about their dreams, you don't necessarily even look at them. Freud would want to sit off on the side and not make eye contact or talk to the patient. He would think of them as patients. The humanistic psychologists, though, would say they're not patients, they're clients. And the client should be someone that we're collaborating with. They can define what their problems are. It's not up to the psychologist to tell them what's wrong with them, why they're sick, and here's this treatment we're going to use on you. Instead, we're going to let the human being with their free will and their own value system and their own goals in life define what's going on and what constitutes a valid solution and what doesn't. But anyway, These kind of thoughts go way back. Friedrich Nietzsche in the 1800s had started laying the foundations for what would eventually become the humanistic psychology approach. Jean-Paul Sartre would also contribute to this. In a lot of ways, the existentialist movement and philosophy is related to the humanistic movement and psychology. And this movement very much believed in free will. Free will is kind of a necessity. You can't be a humanistic psychologist and not believe in free will, because it is ultimately up to you to decide how you're going to react and what you're going to do. You could boil existentialism down to the view of no excuses. You don't control your environment entirely. Sometimes the environment has a lot of control in restricting your behaviors, but you also have lots of freedom within the constraints of your environment. You need to provide your own meaning in life. You need to use your values and decide what you are going to value. You can't just accept whatever value systems were, uh, whatever you were indoctrinated in growing up. You need to decide, you need to evaluate, and you need to form your own morals. Many existentialists were Christians, like Soren Kierkegaard. And Kierkegaard's big problem with Christianity wasn't the tenets of Christianity, it was the way that people engage in Christianity. Kierkegaard would say, people are taught to go to church on Sunday and kneel at certain times and pray at certain times and quote the Bible at people. That's not being a Christian. Kierkegaard thought you needed to have this sort of passionate, internalized belief. And Kierkegaard stayed a Christian, and he just criticized people who were only Christian because that's how they were raised. So humanistic theory isn't against any kind of religion. What it's for is having your own values and having some agency over what your values are and what kind of person you're going to be. They're also responsible for such ideas as self-actualization, if that shouldn't be too surprising. Self-actualization is kind of a tough concept to define, but it has something to do with becoming your ideal self, which is a very important concept in humanistic theory. Something I want you to think about, though, is I think these are some great ideas. I think even if ultimately you really don't have that much control over the environment, it is good to focus on what you can control. I think that's a good thing to focus on an individual level. On a societal level, I think it can sometimes be counterproductive to talk that way, because we want to talk about, on average, people from certain backgrounds systematically and predictably have certain disadvantages compared to other people. So while as an individual you could tell anyone, regardless of their background, that you should exercise the free will that you do have, and to the extent that you can, use your will and your values and your determination to self-actualize. I think whether you're talking about the personal level or the societal level changes this a bit. But all this talk about free will and no excuses, and you ultimately have control within the constraints of your environment over what the outcomes are for you. They even talk sometimes about controlling your personality. Nietzsche talked about deciding what kind of person he's going to be, being the author of his own personality and who he is. Some existentialists said, like Sartre during World War II, he was part of the French resistance to the Nazis, and I believe he was captured at one point and, not treated too well during his living conditions while being captured. And Sartre would write about how, well, even if you're chained to a wall and you're starving, you can still decide that you're going to be content. Some of the stuff I can go along with, but I'm also, as you can tell, a little skeptical. I don't think you have full control over your personality or your values or your beliefs or how you react. I think to some extent you can, and to the extent you can, you should try to control it in the way that you believe is best. But I don't know, how much control do we really have over this stuff? It's a good thing to think about. But going over to the actual psychologists, not just philosophers, you have Abraham Maslow, who helped get the humanistic psychology movement going. Fun fact, Maslow hated his mother, which I was reading a history of psychology and it was very emphatic about that. Maslow did not get along with his mom. Uh, I guess that does perhaps shape who you become, is your relationship with your parents. Something to think about. Maslow took an introductory course in psychology from Titchener at Cornell, and he was very unimpressed. So he went back to New York to marry his first cousin. Can't make this stuff up. Marrying your first cousin, I guess, used to be more accepted back in the day, because Maslow's not the only one that was marrying his first cousin. You find that a lot when you go back, even not even that far back. Anyway, he said that psychology shouldn't just focus on what's wrong with people. It shouldn't just focus on fixing people with problems or trying to fix society's ills and looking at animal behavior and generalizing it to humans, or trying to delve beneath the surface, trying to second guess. Someone says, I can't stop drinking because of these reasons. And then you try and second guess them and say, oh, well, what's the real reason, like beneath the surface, subconsciously, that you keep drinking? Maslow said we should focus instead on helping people. Even if they don't have problems, you could say, well, even people who don't have problems might want to flourish even more than they already are. Even people who are relatively well adjusted might want to be even more well adjusted. Psychology doesn't just have to be about fixing what's negative and bad. It can be about helping and improving what's not even broken to begin with. So Maslow, you see self-actualization up here. So we're definitely in existentialist humanistic territory. Maslow came up with this idea of the hierarchy of needs. So we have physiological needs. This is the boring stuff, like you need clean air, water, shelter, food, clothing, stuff like that. Um, Once those basic needs are met, you need your safety needs. You need to feel like you have stable resources, and that you're not going to be doomed in a few weeks. So once you have those needs met, there's kind of a priority here. Eventually, you have a need. It's just as much of a need as your physiological needs and your safety needs. But just in terms of what needs to be taken care of first, you eventually have the need to be loved and a need to feel like you have belonging. You need to have self-respect and self-esteem. And at the very top of the pyramid, you have a need to become self-actualized. You need to become the person that you aim to be. You need to become your ideal self, which is not something everyone strives for to begin with, and not something a lot of people would even understand at first blush. But Maslow regarded this as something that we have a drive for. Even if you can't really describe it, we do have this drive to become our ideal self. But he readily admitted that not everyone comes anywhere close to doing that. Let's see, then we have Rogers. He is probably the first person out of all the people I've talked to that didn't start off as a physician. He started off in agriculture, worked with children. And you remember when I said the humanistic psychologist said, let's stop calling our, this shouldn't say patience like I'm losing my patience. This should say patience like a doctor sees patients. But anyway, Rogers was the one who said, let's stop calling them patients. Patients are sick people. They're clients. Clients are people that hire you as a consultant. You work together, you collaborate with them. And he said, let's not diagnose disorders. Let's help people with their problems. See, when you talk about disorders, you're using that medical model again, like with patients. You're diagnosing a disease, and Names and labels are very powerful. Let's instead of calling it depression, let's talk about issues with depression. Issues are transitory. Depression is transitory. This has to do with issues in your life. Those can be fixed. These are issues, these are struggles. When you call it a disorder, you make it sound like it's something inherent to the person. And a humanist says, these issues have to do, these aren't diseases, these are just human beings that have problems. And a humanistic psychologist is just here to facilitate people who are trying to solve their own problems. You're not trying to use therapy on them. You're trying to just help them help themselves. All right, that was it for Module 4/Week 4, and I will see y'all in Module 5.